Hey guys, welcome to Catholic in America.
Today we're talking about critical race theory.
We'll be talking about what critical race theory is, where it comes from, as well as what is our Catholic response to it.
So stay tuned as we check out this very important and timely topic. Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to Catholic in America. I'm Father Michael Nixon. I'm joined today by my co-host, Father Tom Dillon, Father Doug Martin, and we're talking about critical race theory.
So please like, share, or subscribe.
So when discussing critical race theory, this is something that has become popularized by authors like Robin DiAngelo and Ibram X. Kendi. Most workplaces have training, sensitivity training or diversity training that includes major elements of critical race theory. So asking that question, what is critical race theory and what is it found in it?
Well, when you go back to its foundations, like critical race theory is founded in what's sometimes referred to as CSL, or critical legal studies, CLS, I'm sorry. So critical legal studies, which was like this movement of predominantly lawyers and people who were involved in the legal profession of trying to make a more equitable and more equal society, looking upon the fact that it seems that within society that the advances that were made in the 1960s and 70s in all the different ways in which we were trying to improve society as a whole didn't work for certain subsects of the population.
Or it's stalled.
Yeah, it's stalled.
It's stalled.
It's stalled out. So like that's one of the origins of what critical race theory is kind of grown out of, is critical legal studies. Critical legal studies, though, came out of another one, which is critical theory. Critical theory, which comes from a school of philosophers predominantly out of France and Germany, of people who basically challenged the foundations of Western society. People like Derrida or Michel Foucault. You'll find that these philosophers, as well as many others, challenged everything that we had presupposed in Western civilization. And so they said, you know, we can't assume these things are true. Using kind of a skepticism as well as kind of this way of saying the things that we have presupposed for the last 2,000 years, maybe these things are not true.
Right. And I think it's important because obviously we can elephant in the room, three white guys talking about critical race theory can automatically on the face be rejected. Well, they don't know what they're talking about. But in a sense, we're talking about the philosophical foundations of this, which come from German and French philosophers, white men, basically, in the academies of Germany and France, and that as being overlaid with real and authentic problems and struggles that we have, and a history of racial tension and violence in our country, and in a sense, what's being used to explain that. So that's really what we're engaging with here. So when we talk about critical race theory, coming out of critical legal studies, we're talking about, let's talk about some tenets of this, and obviously it's not all universally held. Sometimes the objectivity is not there. You know, there's almost an anti-objectivity that's built into the philosophy here. But what are some of the major tenets of critical race theory?
Right. I mean, and also just piggybacking on that for a second, there also seems to be a divergence of opinions as well. This issue is extremely complex, and there's not even agreement inside of the community itself. That, people who adhere to critical race theory, that there's divergences that are in there where some may not even agree with another's methodology. And
that's important to recognize. So looking at what critical race theory is, we're going to talk about some basically held tenets of it, and that kind of across the board. So what are some of the tenets of critical race theory that's important for us to engage with?
Well, that's part of the difficulty with this issue, and that's kind of going to what Doug is saying with critical race theory, is that one of the tenets is that objectivity, and the difficulty of dealing with objectivity, because there's no authority. There's no authority, even like the foundations in critical theory, critical legal studies. There's no universal authority which says that these are the tenets, because actually part of critical race theory says that there is no dogmas and doctrines. It's rooted in a relativistic view of society, that all things that are created are social constructs. Like all the works of human hands are social constructs. They are not rooted in objective reality, but they are the mere creations of human hands. So it is a rejection of objective standards. That standards themselves are subjectively created human constructs.
And that standards or dogmatic truth claims are a movement of power. And we could talk about that a little bit. But so broadly understood, what are some of the tenets of critical race theory?
One of the first and probably one of the primary tenets, again, tenet being a loose word, is that race itself is a socially created construct. As a socially created construct, also that racism is endemic. It permeates all of society. It's very common. And therefore, it's also certain elements of racism are easy to see. Certain elements of racism are harder to see.
And that is permanent.
And it is a permanent, yes. It's a permanent feature of society because it's a permanent creation of power differentials. So those who have power suppressing those who do not have power.
Right. And it also contends racism is much more than just an individual or actions and attitudes, that it's actually systemic, that it's a part of the societal institutions and sectors and constructs. And it's really more broadly understood as white supremacy. And of course, it's white supremacy, we always think about the KKK and, those sort of Aryan movements and all that. But now it's kind of moved even deeper than that white supremacy is not just those things, but it's also in the institutions that were created by, white people.
Well, and to clarify also that, many people, when they think about racism, especially from a traditional Western civilization perspective, is that racism is an individual perspective of my thoughts or my feelings. So it's an individualized experience. The theory, critical race theory, would promote, that's kind of what, is that no, this is not just an individual thing. This is something which is found collectively. This is something which is not just found in persons. It's found in organizations. It's found in institutions. It's a collective reality which is found in non-personal entities such as organizations, institutions, foundations, et cetera.
Laws. Yeah.
Laws, which is where critical legal studies come from as well. So also another kind of tenet, and again, broadly, loosely held, broadly taught, of claims of objectivity, neutrality, universality, meritocracy, and colorblindness, that these are claims, they're actually mechanisms that disguise racism and oppression.
Another one of the most important things that are being postulated by the theory, put forward by the theory, is the notion that objectivity, which also, what does that mean? So the way in which we evaluate common objectivity, for instance, through the scientific method. Actually, critical theory, going back all the way to the Frankfurt School, the Frankfurt School and kind of Derrida and Foucault and things like that challenged the scientific method as being a tool by which the minorities were oppressed. And so it's actually anti-scientific in the sense that it's the anti-scientific method as a way of evaluating. So that's when you say it challenges common understandings of objectivity, like how do you objectively evaluate and determine what truth is? And so in that, there's a lot of ways in which it challenges the modern understanding of objectivity, as well as the modern understanding of what's referred to as neutrality. And that's where you get into CLS, so critical legal studies, which is neutrality under the law. So when you create laws in society which are supposed to create a neutral society, thus colorblindness, critical race is that, no, neutrality in law doesn't actually exist. And so it challenges a lot of the ways in which neutrality under the law, as well as neutrality, does colorblindness actually create a neutral society, or does colorblindness, Martin Luther King's theory of what we need to be able to see beyond color, that I can see people for their merits and so forth. But actually, within the critical race theory, it challenges neutrality. They say, according to the theory, that does not actually work.
So getting into this as well, that the use of language throughout all the critical theories is different than the way words have been used, and kind of challenges that. So we talked about white supremacy, also racism itself. So racism, according to CRT, basically is not just prejudice or hatred against a different race. Right. It's prejudice plus power. That's something that CRT makes very clear, is that it's prejudice plus power. So if you are a disenfranchised minority within a country or institution, then you can't be racist according to these principles as well. And I think too that's something that's going to come up a lot when we talk about this is the difficulties of language and but also for us as Catholics and as Christians, and why we can look at this critically, is recognizing too that we stand on a foundation which is the Word which is God Himself. So we've looked at what the tenets loosely held of critical race theory are, what it's based in as far as critical theory and critical legal studies. Now the question, I think, is why? Why is this so prevalent today, and why are people subscribing to this and using this as a means of explaining and calling for change within society?
I think the easiest thing is that there's injustice in the world, that it does exist and it's there, and that there needs to be something that's done about it, especially if you're the one who's receiving the lack of justice itself.
Yeah, and jumping off of that, people's real experience, and this is not just like individuals, like isolated few people. This is a large segment of society. Although they fall into a minority, people feel and experience oppression. They feel themselves to not be free. They look at the people on the opposite side of where they find themselves to be, and they're like, these people look to be more free of oppressive, free of people coming down and saying, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this. And therefore they want to say, no, why can't I do these things? And I'm finding myself subjected to the opinions or the belief standards of other people.
And even the system is working for the people who have more and have more opportunity. I don't know how to exactly say that.
I mean, it's kind of the colloquial term of the man. If we recognizing that in very real ways, injustice and racially motivated injustice has existed here in the United States for a very long time. And so if you're looking for something to point the finger at, this kind of becomes a clear way of doing that. And I think maybe that's one of the attractions of critical race theory, is it's an explanation of everything. Like, in a sense, critical theories, without having to be nailed down to particular, factual statements, it says this is an explanation of how everything is explained in terms of power. And in a sense, you can always, and this has been going on in the universities for a very long time. I was a history major at Florida State, and this is something that was coming up. But again, it's been popularized now. It's now becoming, in a sense,
mainstream, really.
Yeah, mainstreamed now. But it's been at the universities for a very long time.
Well, I'm going back to a little bit to the history. That was one of the reasons for why CLS kind of broke off, or at least they used CT, critical theory. But one of the problems that CLS recognized within critical theory was the fact that there was lacking in praxis, or another way of saying that, lacking in movement. Like, it's great to talk about these things, but how are we going to change this? And that's why CLS was about, let's make some changes. Let's not just talk about these issues, let's make changes. And that's why the changes, which is within critical race theory, jumping off of CLS, is that, the changes have not been enough. And now it's become much more of a movement. And therefore, like in critical race theory, the movement or the praxis is to move. Like, we want to move.
And it's deconstructionism.
And deconstructionism.
Is the movement. That's
yes.
Basically, so any structure within society needs to be deconstructed. And that's interesting too, because to me, in a sense, one of the other attractions to this and why this is probably so widespread is it gives a clear way to be good without actually having to change that much. Like, I could be good as long as I believe the right things about white privilege, or believe the right things about society or systemic racism, that all I need to do in order to be good is to believe those things. I don't actually have to
Right.
I don't have to change, really. Yeah. I mean, there's not much. I have to, post about it on social media. So in a sense, there's an attractiveness. I want to be good. Everyone desires to be good. Right. And in this way, I don't actually have to do the hard work of growing in virtue, but I can, just subscribe to a belief.
No, and the problem, according to critical race theory, is the structures themselves, that they're created by the majority for the advantage of the majority, which leaves the minority wanting. The movement that has not been created is because of the structures themselves. And so that's the explanation as to why there hasn't been more movement. So it's something else that's got to be deconstructed, something else that's got to be changed and made to work for everyone.
Yeah, so also within the theory is this notion that oppression, and as a general idea, like it does make sense. All forms of oppression which oppress the freedom of individuals or of groups, if you have any form of oppression, oppression is evil, or oppression is bad, oppression is wrong. And so, like, in this, you'll find this, and this is where you'll get to some of the foundational thinkers, such as Michel Foucault, who was a French philosopher, a queer philosopher in France, who basically said that this notion of that power differentials is that you'll find that you have certain segments of the population which are in the majority. You have certain segments of the population which are in the minority. And the majority uses their greater power, their greater strength, to oppress the minorities. And so that's why critical race theory is not just about racism. And that's where people get confused because they're like, I thought we were talking about race here. This includes anyone who finds themselves in a minority, who find themselves oppressed or feeling or experiencing oppression by the majority of opinions or the majority of truths and the majority of standards or the majority of laws. So therefore, anyone who finds themselves, whether it be LGBTQ, whether it be people of color, whether it be people of varying different opinions and things like that, who find themselves, anyone who finds themselves in a minority,
gender differently abled.
Anyone who finds themselves in a minority is being oppressed. And therefore, this is an experience of oppression. This is where I'm not free, and therefore, the human spirit was created for freedom, the human experience is for freedom, and therefore, by what right are you oppressing my individual freedoms?
So much so that to say something is normal by the majority group is an oppression of the minority group, because what we consider normal may not be in the lived experience of the group.
Something interesting that's come up a lot recently is an attraction, again, so why people subscribe to this, the critical theories maybe across the board and critical race theory that we're talking about today, is in a sense, an attractiveness towards being part of an oppressed group, which seems strange, but you kind of see people like, that's why you have an intersectionality to say like, well, I may not be a person of color, but I'm a woman, or I might not be a woman, but I'm gay, or I might not be gay, but whatever it is, I'm differently abled. There's all sorts of kind of things in a sense to try to say, how can I find myself somewhere within this that helps me to, in a sense, have an identity. I think that's maybe one of the things too that in a postmodern society, there's an attraction towards having some sort of identity. So again, some of the why there. I think what we've discussed is that this has been coming up for a long time in the universities, has been coming up in different grievance study areas, and
especially because of lack of movement. That progress, there's not been enough progress made, that it still exists, that there's still oppression, that there's still opportunities for racism, no matter how you define it.
Yeah. So we brought up a lot of different things here, a lot of what critical race theory is, why people believe it. And we're going to get in, when we come back from our break, we're going to get in a little to our response as Catholics to this, how we are called to respond, how we are called to engage with this. So thank you so much, and we'll see you right after this break. Hey guys, thanks for checking out Catholic in America. I'm Father Michael Nixon, and I like to party.
And I am Father Tom Dillon, priest here in the Diocese of Pensacola, Tallahassee. I think I have the longest hair in probably the state, and I too like to party. I like whiskey and cigars.
Father Doug Martin. I'm also a priest here in the Diocese of Pensacola, Tallahassee, and I'm married and roll tide.
Oh my goodness. Yes, sir. I was okay with the being married part, but the real tide thing. In Catholic in America, we engage the intersection between faith and culture.
Tune in every week because no topic is out of bounds.
We want to thank you so much for supporting this show by watching it, by liking, sharing, and subscribing. How else can they support the show?
You can also become a patron on Patreon and support us financially.
So if you support us, there's all kinds of swag. There's t-shirts, there's coffee mugs, or maybe bumper stickers. I don't know, maybe we could come up with a wig from Father Tom.
Father Tom wig would go a long way. So thanks for your support. God bless y'all, and check us out next time on Catholic in America. Hey guys, welcome back to Catholic in America. We are talking about critical race theory today.
Please like, share, and subscribe.
And as always, we thank you for your great support. And if you'd like to continue your support, or if you've never supported us before, please support us on Patreon.
So one of the things I think that is important for us, that we always got to come back to Jesus. Jesus is as a Catholic, that he has to inform our response to everything. So the constant call of the Lord to allow our hearts to be changed, that the Lord came to heal the brokenhearted, to set the captives free, to give sight to the blind. So that always has to be our starting point whenever we talk about a difficult issue like critical race theory or like racism in general.
Well, and I think that it's also important to recognize that within critical race theory, the goodness of it, like the value of critical race theory is that it's trying to address social sin. It's trying to address social evils. The difficulty from the Catholic position is that it's trying to address social sins or social evils apart from the figure of Christ. And that's where Jesus is absolutely central as a Catholic response to grave, not just individual evils, but also social evils and social sins. And so from that standpoint, though, like the critical race, though, is theory tries to do that, but without the person of Christ.
And, I mean, just understanding that racism is a pro-life issue. I mean, it is something as Catholics and as Christians that we should care about. And I think if you ask most people, they would say, yeah, I care about that. But we need to be asking questions of why and how. And sometimes we aren't doing that. Instead, we're just responding to what we see and what we don't like, rather than trying to understand where each person is coming from.
The criticism that come up too, the criticisms, as soon as it makes me uncomfortable, it's very easy to reject it. It's like I'll believe whatever you say, whatever the Bible teaches, whatever Jesus says, as long as I don't have to change. Right. I think that's always the question. So one of the things that comes up a lot as far as justice in society, that we're striving. We're not just, well, one day we'll all be in heaven. We're working to build a more just society, cooperating with the structures, recognizing we're in a fallen world that's afflicted by sin. But I love this quote from Gaudium et Spes, which is a major document in the church about the church's engagement in the world. The joys and hopes, the griefs and the anxieties of the people of this age, especially those who are poor or in any way afflicted, these are the joys and hopes, the griefs and anxieties of the followers of Christ. So we need to ask that question. Are we having those conversations with people who are actually experiencing the history of racism and impacting their lives today? Because if not, like we're not being faithful to our own teachings. We're not being faithful to what the gospel.
Yeah, we're not walking with them.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I mean, we're called to walk with those who are oppressed, those who are hurting, those who need help. I mean, that's been the church's mission all along. And so, if we're ever going to understand this, then there has to be conversation, even when the conversation gets difficult and tough.
One of the things that I think comes up a lot too is, and this is hopefully where our critique is coming in of critical race theory, is the philosophical presuppositions. And one of the things that, in a sense, I think is one of the great aspects of the Catholic Church is we engage in philosophy. We engage in self-criticism, in being able to see reason and being able to engage with different philosophies. But one of the inherent to critical race theory is if you question critical race theory, then you are inherently racist, which I think is a non-starter, and that needs to be brought out to the fore to say, like, you can't have a philosophical system that in and of itself can't dialogue with other philosophical systems, can't bear to be questioned. Can't be questioned.
Well, and that goes to the whole kind of the
which is what we're accused of all the time. So
but we get it. It goes back to kind of Derrida, the philosopher Derrida, who was like, let's be critical of everything that came before. But with the problem with deconstructionism in general, as well as with Derrida and a lot of these different thinkers, is that where is the self-analysis? And that's part of what actually, from our Christian perspective, is that Christ calls us to to analyze other systems and things like that as we promote the gospel into the world today. But also the gospel calls us not just to tell other people the truth, but also tells us to look inward at ourselves and see, how does the truth apply to me? First apply to me so that I'm looking at the log in my own eye and not the splinter in others. But that I'm looking inward first. And so like there's this first inward introspection, ideally, that Christianity, now do all Christians do this? No. And have we done this perfectly as a collective church? No, at times we've not. But still, there is rooted within our tradition, as well as within our philosophy and our faith, is this introspective of being self-critical. And the problem, one of the main critiques of critical race theory, as well as all the critical theory, is that it's critical of others, but where's the self-analysis? Where is the recognition of that there might be problems within this particular theory? Like, where is that happening, as opposed to just pointing the finger at others? Like, where's the self-introspection?
Yeah, because justice comes, really justice does come from, really coming to grips with the painful past and the painful history. And we're asking, critical race theory is asking others to be, critical of that, to really think about that and take that into consideration. And I do think that is a good thing that we should be doing as Americans, as Christians, as Catholics, is looking at the ways in which our society, our structures have been racist in the past, and trying to assure those ideas aren't still there, aren't still prevalent, and aren't still an issue to it. But when we find those inequities, we have to be willing to name them and repent of them, to be able to move on from those things ourselves. Not move on in the sense of we forget them, but move on in the sense of correcting them and trying to make up for some of the past, but also to making sure and assure that this isn't going to continue to happen in the future.
Well, and also that there's not this total depravity of the past. That's one of the difficulties of critical race theory, is that it assumes this total depravity of all past intentionalities of whoever created these particular structures. So like if these particular structures were created by a majority, that there is almost a total depravity, almost like this Lutheran total depravity of human nature, of all these things, and that if the majority created it, it has to be torn down because it is totally corrupt. And it's going
to in the cancel culture.
Yeah, and it's going to totally suppress those in minorities. And so like within that though, like not everything, you can have a person who creates good structures. And that's why like a structure, when it's created, is created, yes, it might be flawed if the principles of the structure are flawed. But just because the intentions of a person, like that's where like when we look at it from a Catholic perspective, only God knows the mind and the heart. And for me to read intentionality is for me to judge the mind and heart of another human being. And I don't know what that, just as like the validity of people who advocate like this is my experience and I've experienced racism. I don't know that. Maybe I don't know that because I don't know your story. On the other hand, like to judge people from the past and to read intentionality and motive into this without looking and finding it present in the principles. That's why like structures, institutions are created upon principles. Now, principles can be racist if they are actually, and you can prove them objectively. That's why, but it's not like this magical understanding of how sin is translated. It's like if a structure is racist, like you have to say, where's the principle?
And that gets a lot into the narrative as well. Like this, which I think is important. There's something important about that, about what is my story, even story of faith and conversion, or my story of woundedness. People that are in counseling or other things too, on a personal level, they have to come to grips with their story. In a sense, we have to come to grips with our story of our society, of our church, of our world. But to reduce all truth to that, I think is that it's that plus the story, and maybe that's where I think we need to do a better job of telling the story, which is that God has triumphed over sin and death. That evil does not have the last word, and that Jesus' death on the cross has destroyed the powers of sin and death and the devil. And I think maybe one of the struggles that we have with this kind of overarching narrative of racism in critical race theory is that it's this power in the world that has never been defeated and never, in a sense, never will be defeated, which I am against, and in a sense kind of leads to like a hopelessness, because the statement basically, if you are of a dominant racial identity, then you're always going to be racist. You can be you can work against it, you can kind of revoke your privilege and different things, but instead to say like Jesus' death actually did triumph over all sin, including racism. Right. And if we don't recognize that, then unfortunately, painful parts of our own history become the story rather than part of the story that God is actually doing something beautiful. He's actually redeeming our story. So I like to dive into kind of like how this interfaces with theology too, and how this is seeped into preaching and teaching and engagement with social issues. But looking at this, like you were saying something about the critical theory and our understanding of the word critical and how important it is to distinguish the two uses.
Well, and that's the problem of language. And I think that all of us have had experiences where you use one word and another person thinks they understand it, and that's why like in marriage counseling and things like that, like one of the rules that we give to people, which is a really great one, is like, this is what you said, this is what I heard, what did you mean? Because like so much conflict in the world is unnecessary, but is due to Babel. I mean, going back to the story of Babel in the Old Testament, and the misunderstanding of language. But that's where sometimes like people, you can also equivocate in language, which means that you have one definition, but another person substitutes a different definition. And that's where you get into like the problems with a lot of the conflict that we experience in the world is due to equivocation and is due to this misunderstanding of language. So when you look at like that's why definitions are really important, like definitions, because without definitions, without hard definitions, like we're all using loosey-goosey language, which is going to cause confusion and is going to cause unnecessary conflicts. So like when you look even at the word critical, like within the critical studies, like this is not the way that people commonly understand the word critical, because within CRT, CT, CLS, the word critical is a criticism of what is already present, versus it is not meant in the academic sense. In the academic sense, is I'm going to do a critical analysis of this, an objective analysis where I'm going to use an objective standard.
Where I can and should be criticized,
and
basically.
where I open myself up to criticism to others, because now here's the standard, you can evaluate it. I mean, in the Catholic Church, that's one of the things that we provide is the dogmas, the doctrines, where you can evaluate it, you can look at it, you can test it, and you can judge whether or not you believe this to be true. That's where, like within the studies, that's why they don't give, within CRT, they don't give hard definitions because one, they don't believe that they exist. Mm-hmm. And so like that's where like one of the main conflicts comes in. And the same thing with like racism is like the definition of racism is evolving and changing. Right. And in that sense, it's evolving and changing, and it's self-perpetuating because it will always expand and grow. And
it's interesting because I think this is where we come back to the objective reality, and in a sense is explicitly rejected. Objective truth is explicitly rejected by the critical theories
and most objective definitions.
Because when it disproves the theory, it's because it's racist, or it's because it's against the minority, or it's because it's coming from a place of power. So in a sense, it makes us incapable of having any conversation, which our faith, going back to our Jewish roots, so much of it comes from dialogue, comes from being able to engage and disagree and still love, coming from a place of love, hopefully. One of the things, and I think maybe this draws into our own understanding of our theology too, is I think in the church, maybe in the American church, that we get sometimes very comfortable with acts directed at helping individuals, but not necessarily asking the questions of why do these individuals need help. I always think about this phrase, and it's a damning phrase that says, if you help the poor, they call you a saint. If you ask why are they poor, they call you a communist. I mean, that's one of those questions. Why are these people poor? Be like, hey, don't ask those questions. In a sense, it's kind of like, but we should be able to ask those questions because we stand on a foundation of who we are as Christians, and we're calling for personal conversion, and we're looking towards heaven, but we're also saying, like, in the here and now, how can I help people to better their circumstances and their situations?
Right, kind of using that phrase, the poor will always be among you. Mm-hmm. You don't really need to ask that question because it's just an accepted thing. It's always going to be there. Instead of asking, well, why is that even? Why must they be there? Is that really what Jesus intended with that message, with his statement?
Well, and within critical race theory, like this is where the narrative expression of narratives are important, which obviously narratives are hugely important when understanding another person's perspective, where they're coming from. But in the narrative approach to things, which kind of paints a narrative as opposed to looking at facts, things like that. So the narrative is that the reason why poverty exists as a reality in America today is because of the effects, obviously, of slavery. Like that's why many people believe themselves to be oppressed by white privilege, oppressed by white power, and therefore they find that. But that's a very simple narrative for a very complex reality. Yes, absolutely, the effects of slavery in the United States have long-standing effects, which we're still experiencing to this day. But there's also lots of other effects, and that's where, like, the narrative, if you paint the narrative as a singular reason, which is that this is a consequence of slavery, that negates other possible narratives which other people are talking about, such as the breakdown in the families, the consequence of the 1960s and the sexual revolution, like the advance of artificial contraception and the decrease in birth rate. All of these things which also affect and are pieces of poverty. I mean, the effects of Planned Parenthood and the effects of Margaret Sanger and W.E.B. Du Bois, who came out with these social theories that this is going to eliminate poverty, and yet all that we've had is actually the reverse. And so painting poverty into kind of this one facet or this one feature that it's a consequence of slavery is, I think it's an oversimplification of a very complex thing. And that's one of the reasons I would say that Jesus did say the poor will always be among you, because there are many factors upon which poverty comes in and is still present in the world.
And they're not negligible, so it's not, huge. I always think the Catholic both and is so important here, where it's not this like, oh, slavery was a long time ago, that kind of callous, or Jim Crow was, not that long ago, but redlining was up until very, very recently, but it's not happening now. It's now illegal. In a sense, that the effects of those, of accumulated wealth, the effects of mass incarceration, the effects of vagrancy laws in the South that picked up black men for just not having a job after being freed slaves, and so put them in the prison system. The cycles of that, not access to school, all those things, those are real. And in addition to that, the breakdown of family life. And in addition to that, the sin in every human heart, our own tendencies towards lust or greed or pride. So it's both of those things. So we need to call for the conversion of organizations and systems and things, and reach out to people while we still maintain that every single person stands before God and is called to convert, to become holy, become a better man, better woman. So growing in virtue, those sorts of things. So it's that Catholic both and that I think is so critical. That is scapegoat, or just says, well, the system has to change, and so therefore I don't have to change, which I think comes from a lot of people who hold with these theories as well, who aren't necessarily a minority.
Yeah. Not only do you have to, you're incapable of it. I mean, that's some of what this says is that the reason why we have to change the system is because as an individual or as a collective group, you're incapable of change. And so we have to create something where we change your actions, not from within, but from without.
But I think that also recognizing the greatest praxis, right, going back to the word praxis, the greatest movement towards change, which can happen within the individual or collectively within the society. And this is obviously from our Catholic perspective. I mean, this is one of our basic tenets, is that the truth, capital T, the truth will set you free. Because where does freedom come from? And where is the source of freedom? And where does freedom come from? Is freedom a subjective experience, or is freedom an objective reality? And so that notion of the truth, where will freedom come from? Will freedom come from the state? Will freedom come from where I'm able to do whatever I want? Or is freedom an encounter with objective truth? And that's where looking at the objectivity of truth, as well as it is truth that will set you free. That's why when Jesus shows up before Pilate, and you have that whole famous conversation between Jesus and Pilate, which is, I am the truth. And then he's like, truth, what is that? But if you deny truth, objective truth, you will always find yourself in a enslaved state, because it's truth that sets you free, not my personal truth, not my narrative truth. It's the truth which unites all human beings together as one. One of the things which actually I do like within critical race theory is this notion is that race is a social construct, because that's part of the theory is that race being a social construct, there's just one humanity.
Amen. Yeah.
And that we are all one, we are one, there is one humanity, and that all these things that divide us are oftentimes social constructs. And I would agree with that in a limited sense, but it's also it's the truths, it's universal truths, it's objective truths which will unite us together. The greatest truth being the person of Jesus Christ, who came into the world to offer us freedom. And any route to freedom that tries to get to freedom, get through the gate, without going through Jesus, you cannot get through the gate without that truth.
So this, obviously this begins the conversation, and we're hoping to have some other conversations here on the show with other thinkers and people who have been engaging with these questions of racism, of injustice, of critical race theory, of a lot of the modern social movements that we're seeing on a daily basis. But hopefully this conversation begins to help people to look at this with a critical lens, to be able to speak the truth too. I think that's one of the things as well, that we can't just go along with things just because we'd be a pariah if we didn't. Right. That we have to have the courage to be able to stand in the truth and to be able to recognize that these theories, they might have some limited applications, but they don't tell the whole story. And the gospel, Jesus Christ fully reveals this to ourselves. So it's really only in him that we find that real hope for change and transformation of individuals and of society as a whole. So thank you guys so much for joining with us in this conversation about critical race theory. Thank you for all those who are subscribing and liking and sharing these videos, all those who are supporters on Patreon as well. We can't do this without your help. Until next time, we'll see you on Catholic in America.